Welcome back, everyone. Today on the Jake Broe Show, we are joined by Caolan Robertson. He is Irish, and he has been on the ground reporting in Ukraine, I think, for almost a year now. What are his previous accomplishments? He's the director of Under the Deadly Skies, available now on Apple TV. He's also done the documentary Hunted in Kherson, available on YouTube. He's a regular contributor to the LBC and Times Radio. Caolan, thank you so much for joining the channel. How are you doing today?
I'm really good. I just got back from a quick break from rural Ireland, which I desperately needed. It's been so intense reporting on the ground and going to Syria. So I'm feeling refreshed back in Ukraine, but yeah, good.
So I first met you, I think, over 6 months ago. You set me up with an interview with Byline TV, but you're not currently with Byline TV at the moment?
So I still produce a show for them every now and then called Frontline Byline, and I still write articles with Byline, but I've started to focus in the last 3 or 4 months specifically on frontline reporting just full time. And it's really hard even to delegate 1 day a week, 2 days a week, doing other work when you're traveling, when you're on the field. And after I went to Kherson, I basically realized I want to just full time, constantly make these on the ground reports. So I do that sort of less frequently with Byline now, but every now and then when something big in politics happens, I'll do a one-off show with Byline.
So you've gone to focus on being an independent journalist, and you could go to any conflict in the world. You could be talking about anything in the world. Why did you choose to focus on Ukraine?
Yeah, it's pretty wild that I'm able to do it just full time now. I mean, Ukraine, I first arrived in this country 2 years ago yesterday, Valentine's Day. And I was here to make a short film with John Sweeney. He's a veteran war correspondent. He confronted Vladimir Putin personally about the shooting down of MH17. And I had directed his last film before the war broke out about the connection between Boris Johnson and Alexander Lebedev, these cagey connections between British politicians and dirty Russian oligarchs and money. And that film premiered January 2022. And then all hell breaks loose in Europe. Russia invades. John calls me and he says, Caolan, I'm going to go, he was with Byline full time. He was like, I'm going to go straight to Ukraine and I'm going to do, a war diary every single day. They're updating on what's going on. Do you want to come? Byline were a little nervous for me to go because they were like, Caolan, you've never even covered a protest, never mind a war. So I don't really think you're quite ready for this. So went to the Polish border instead. And I remember the first time I got there, I think this was probably 25th of February, 2022, just seeing waves and waves of humanity, of just women and children pouring across the border. I think millions of people over the course of a week into Poland, and just people with signs all over Europe with different destinations on them who had driven to the border to offer people a place in their houses. And it was like seeing the best of humanity, seeing people all over Europe rescuing these refugees, and the worst of humanity, the fascism that brought them and pushed them across the border. So I just never seen anything like this. And I immediately became obsessed and hooked with Ukraine and what was going on. It looked like I was witnessing the refugee crises that Europe saw, that I read about in textbooks in World War II. And, I was the director of Byline TV at the time, and I was making lots of documentaries about Brexit, people that regretted their vote. Sort of back when I was very young, I used to work with some right-wing media and regretted, having some of those views. And so through Byline, found so many different people, subjects that countered disinformation. I know how it works. I know how dirty Russian money works. And so I'd done so much stuff with Byline over the years that I really felt that Ukraine was the pinnacle of disinformation. Russia had done a huge disinformation campaign before they tried to take Ukraine, and they hammered our social media news feeds for the months after they tried to take Kyiv. And I remember seeing the stuff about Bucha being faked, the stuff about Ukraine being full of Nazis, and having seen how propaganda works on the inside, I was like, I got to get into this country and I want to do some reports exposing the truth. And a year later, 11 months after the invasion, John called me again and he said, it's the year anniversary, why don't you come back? Why don't you come to Kyiv for the first time? I was supposed to go for 3 days, landed in this city on the train, and didn't know what to expect. I'd never been really to Eastern Europe, never mind Ukraine, and didn't really know anything about it before the invasion, and thought that this place would be in total turmoil, miserable, on edge. And I arrived on Valentine's Day, and there were people in this beautiful city in Kyiv with flowers everywhere, celebrating love. There was a flower seller sitting in front of a pile of sandbags, offering roses to people. And I was thinking, how are people celebrating Valentine's Day? I thought there was bombs every 2 seconds. I thought that it was everything is in despair. So I took out my camera and I started interviewing people and asking them why it's important to celebrate love despite war. And so many people turned around and said things like, because love is victory and that's how we're going to win. And I honestly, that day, fell in love with the soul that I found in the city. And I started hearing stories from soldiers on the front line and volunteers talking about the mass graves, talking about how there was use of white phosphorus, of chemical weapons on the front lines. And I didn't really know that much about it, which I felt was a bit of a failure for the mainstream media. They hadn't consistently looked into and documented this stuff, as much as the fact that even me working in media didn't really know about it. So I felt compelled to want to go to the front lines and find this stuff, go to the places these volunteers were telling me about. And I couldn't sleep every night here in Kyiv thinking about it. And so I asked John, can we go to the Donbass? Can we go to the front? And can we capture this stuff actually happening? And he said, yeah, if you do a 3-day training course with the Ukrainian military. So I was like, okay, I could do a 3-day training course with the military. So I ended up doing this super high intensity thing where, they had these sets with, ambulances. They would replicate the aftermath of a missile attack and you'd have to run and put tourniquets on. And it was just like a whirlwind of just information, super, super scary. Again, I'd never been anywhere like that. And we all just jumped in a car 3 days after and headed east. And that's when I made Under Deadly Skies. That's when I started seeing war close up. The first time I heard an artillery shell, I nearly screamed and wanted the car to drive back. And John had to reassure me and basically say, Caolan, there's a difference between incoming and outgoing. If it sounds like this and it's a pop and it's close, it's going this way. If it's incoming, you can feel it through your shoes, through the ground. This is outgoing, it's okay. And I didn't even understand the concept of that and how to think like that. And just every day in this environment. But we captured evidence of chemical weapons. We captured use of white phosphorus in villages where there were no military activity and brought it back to Kyiv. I had it analyzed by experts. And they said, if you found this in an area with no military activity, this is a war crime, you should submit it to the ICC. And I realized that none of the work I'd ever done before with Byline or anything before felt as meaningful as that. And I just couldn't believe that it hadn't been documented enough. And I realized, looking back, it's because it's so expensive to get to the front. If you're mainstream media, it's like $10,000 a day sometime for life insurance and for camera insurance. And there just isn't the resources of media anymore to cover this. And I remember after we released this film, it won 12 awards, the evidence was submitted to the ICC. I went back to London and tried to carry on doing day-to-day British politics, talk about Brexit, talk about general stuff that I was doing before, the price of eggs going up and down, Tories or Conservatives, who's going to win? And it all just felt numb. It all just felt like noise. I even tried to have regular conversations again with the friends that I used to have before I went to Ukraine about gossip and drama in London, and I just couldn't think of anything other than Ukraine. And I felt like a part of me changed or died when I went to the east in this country, and I just felt like I needed to be here. And so for months with Byline, I tried to grapple that, reconcile that. I thought of excuses and reasons to come back here just for a weekend to do follow-ups, and it just wasn't working. And that's when I decided to move full time here and document the stuff that I saw on a bigger scale as much as possible, which was a huge risk, right? Like just giving up everything. I sold everything that I had in my house and just moved to Odessa. And that's when we first did that's when you first met me. And it's basically for that reason. But that's when I first got here. And yesterday was Valentine's Day, which felt really symbolic, arriving back in the city from Ireland and looking at it again. And it was exactly the same. Snow-covered streets, beautiful, and everyone celebrating love. Restaurants full of flowers and heart balloons. Never thought I would find myself living here in 2025 when just 2 years ago I thought I would be here for 3 days,
What you're doing is what is supposed to happen. People becoming primary sources to a historical event. You're on the ground documenting what's actually happening, and we live in the information age where anyone in the world can instantaneously receive your evidence, your testimony, your images. So my next question, how are people disbelieving this? Russian propaganda is so effective that lots of my fellow Americans are in denial, saying that war crimes are not occurring, or Russia is justified, or the people of Ukraine are Nazis, or whatever nonsense. So I gotta get your thoughts. Like, how are we living in a world where reality, your pictures and videos and firsthand testimony is rejected on social media in favor of whatever Tim Pool is saying or Dave Rubin, people taking millions of dollars from the Kremlin to just say, Ukraine is the enemy of the West and they're a bunch of corrupt Nazis and Russia is acting in self-defense. I just want to get your thoughts. How does it feel like we're losing the information battle on social media? How is this possible?
Well, it's good to call it an information battle because that's what it is, but only one side is actually fighting that battle, and that's Russia, and they've been doing it for decades. Russia sees information in exactly the same way as we see ammunition and artillery cells as information, and they weaponize it in a way that we don't. There are entire departments of the government in in Moscow that are dedicated to combat propaganda, to spending billions pumping Western news feeds with misinformation, funneling money into the far left, into the far right, to cause social division, to interfere with elections, and to make us distrust our own institutions, and to make us distrust things like this in Ukraine. And I know some of this because, again, when I was very young, I was hired by Rebel Media. They had also worked with Tim Pool, Lauren Southern. These are the people involved in Tenet. And for about 6 months, I was making videos about free speech, LGBT rights, this sort of stuff, this sort of very light stuff, and then started to get more and more involved and speaking to more of the people in Rebel and in similar kind of networks, and realized that there was something really nefarious going on. Invites to Moscow, invites to Russia, strange funding coming in, and much more extreme views behind the scenes than were being put out publicly. So I left all that years ago and then spent probably the last 7 years dedicated to content looking at how disinformation works, because it was so dark seeing the inside of it, a bit like how Bill Browder worked with Putin and is now really good and qualified about talking about how the Kremlin works. And Russia spending billions and billions on things like Tenet Media, which are just the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of versions of Tenet Media in every country in the West, is why people don't know what's happening in Ukraine. It's why when I arrived in Ukraine in 2022, I didn't know about the mass torture that was taking place against civilians. I thought it was the Russian army versus the Ukrainian army. I didn't know it was the Russian army versus humanity, women, children, everything. And that's because of disinformation, and it's one-sided. Our governments don't recognize the Russian threat, they don't understand how serious it is, and they act too little, too late. No one has been prosecuted properly or fined properly for the Tenet Media scandal because everyone in the West is terrified of infringing on press freedom, which, by the way, none of these people are journalists. Tim Pool isn't a journalist. Lauren Shen isn't a journalist, so we don't have to worry about that. But two, fighting back. We don't fight Russian disinformation with facts on a government level. We leave it to our media to do fact checking. Our media that's broken, that isn't working anymore, that's hemorrhaging staff, that's losing advertising revenue, and that can barely afford full-time war correspondents here in Ukraine to even capture what's going on. So the entire ecosystem is completely destroyed. And that's how Russia's won so much in the information war space. And that's, again, why I need to feel compelled to go to the front lines in these countries and to capture this stuff firsthand, because a lot of the time, if you get something on a ground source, it's indisputable, you can put it out there, and at least it's tangible and it's real. But still, through AI and through all the different techniques Russia's been using in the last number of decades, it's just a drop in the ocean. But there are training courses within the Kremlin called combat propaganda that have been going on for decades. Russia has been gearing up for this, and they know how easy it is to buy the West. It's again, Russian mentality views an S-300 missile in exactly the same way as a bot farm, weapons against the West, and they use them in the same way. And our governments don't understand the Russian threat enough, because our leaders also go to colleges and universities with Russian students in high society. Russians have infiltrated our society with oligarchs, with filthy Russian money. London is one of the worst money laundering capitals in the world for Russian money. And so we allow them to get away with it because we let them infiltrate our society, a rogue mafia state infiltrating Europe. And it's depressing. It's depressing. Again, the film I made with John Sweeney was about Boris Johnson when he was Home Secretary, going against his security advice on his own to Perugia, which is in Italy, to stay at Alexander Lebedev's mansion in a place called the Russian Mountain and have these high society parties where they were likely being filmed and there was compromising material on all of them. We've seen this with Trump. We've seen this with loads of our leaders. An Italian intelligence report suggested that Boris Johnson is compromised and has been at those parties. And that's why we don't take the threat seriously enough, because we've been too lax in our security, haven't taken Russians seriously enough, and we've just allowed them to pump our news feeds with misinformation. And it's like, so unbelievably damaging. It's the same as committing terrorist attacks on a daily basis in terms of how much it destroys and fractures society, and we don't do a thing about it. I don't know. It drives me absolutely insane. But it's been going on for years. They started this war, and we don't even want to fight back.
I do agree. On the government level, there is serious apprehension to combat misinformation or propaganda, because then, as a democracy, you look like you're the one putting out propaganda. Even if you're just trying to counter what the Russian government is doing, we would have to be transparent, because democracies have to be transparent about what they're doing, but the Russians are not. I mean, the information's there, it's available, everyone knows what they're doing, but the Russian people aren't outraged by it. Like, you can't be outraged by what your government is doing in Russia. Russians have
No.
no say in their governments. But in the West, we can. And I think a lot of people would just feel uncomfortable if their government was engaging in information shaping operations, even if it's to our national benefit, even if it's countering obvious propaganda efforts from the Chinese or the Russian governments. I mean, we're losing. If I'm just being honest, we're losing the information battle being fought on social media when someone like Elon Musk, with his over 200 million followers, like, his feed is insane. This guy is the CEO of like 5 companies, and he almost never tweets about his companies or products. Today, it's just a post every 30 minutes. We hate federal judges, active federal judges. You know, USAID created COVID-19 that killed millions of people. He just said it. Like, he just makes up insane, outrageous lies, and the goal is chaos and confusion, anarchy. You know, I don't think America is going to do anything to prevent or stop this the next 4 years. Europe's going to have to do more, and we need it to stop. We need the infiltration of all of this misinformation and hate coming from the Russian government. So I want to ask you, because you're one of the few people who have been to Russia during this war. Can you explain to the audience where you went, when was this, and what did you see and learn there?
Yeah, the full report I'm actually bringing out in a few days. It took a really long time to get it checked with all the different units, with the SBU, to make sure it was all allowed. And you have to give this period of time before going and things changing before you can show what's going on. But I had a friend called Tom Much who lives in Kyiv, and he joined me for a drink one night a few months ago, and he said, Caolan, I've just been on holiday. And I went, oh, really? And he said, yeah, and I went without a passport. I went, oh, really? And he said, yeah, it was called Russia. I said, oh my gosh, you went to Kursk. And I didn't really know it was possible to do this as basically an independent person. And he said, yeah, there's a way to do it. It's pretty tricky, it's pretty complicated, but you should go. And I hadn't seen many reports filmed in Kursk that were interviewing actual Russians living there and doing like a proper comprehensive look of what it's like inside. So that's what I wanted to do. So I did like a massive trip all the way from Pokrovsk, which was, you know, being kind of taken at the moment, all the way up to Sumy. This was few hundred kilometers. We were delivering drones to lots of different units across the front with one team, one fight, with Harry, Estonian Harry. And we got to Sumy, and it looked like it was too late to go in because the counter-offensive had just started. The North Koreans had just arrived. So I was like, oh, we can't go in. And then at the very last second, at about 11 p.m., we got a phone call from one of the units that said, actually, do you still want to go to Suja? Do you still want to go to Kursk? And I said, yeah. And they said, okay, meet us at 7 o'clock in the morning. We're going to take you in. And look, I went in not as press, because as soon as the counter-offensive started, no civilians, no press were allowed in. But the military, the local military who were running at that time, said that they were happy to do it on a personal level. So it was pretty unprecedented access. And I wanted to find out if the counter-offensive had started and how Russians were living there. Also, Russia seems like a bit of a shithole. There's been lots of reports about this, and I like to investigate things myself on the ground. So I'd like to see if Russia really is a shithole. Russians had been so annoyed at me for calling the country a wasteland for so long, so I just needed to investigate for myself and see how it was. And also, I'd never been to Russia, so I thought it was a great, great opportunity for a quick trip. We steam across the checkpoint, the Welcome to Russia checkpoint. It's all blown up, and within about 10 seconds, two tanks on fire come steaming past our car. The back of them had been on fire. They'd been hit by FPV drones. And there's this like massive smoke clearing. This is the one road in and out of Suja. And I was just immediately like, okay, this is probably a really bad idea. We should go back. I was like, can we please turn back? My whole body was just like drained of blood. I was like, no. We don't want to go down the road where two cars have just come from that are on fire. And the driver says, I don't think we want to follow the tanks on fire. I think there's probably two FPV drones following them too. I think the safest thing to do is keep going. And we had this sort of drone detector at the front of the car that tells you how many drones are in the air. And it was beeping nonstop. It was picking up about 10 Landsets, reconnaissance. So this was just absolutely the most insane situation. We get into Suja, and I actually managed to get into the shopping center in the middle of the city, and things started to destabilize quite rapidly. So the locals, the Russians, were looting everything. I think because the counteroffensive had begun and things started getting really wild, there were rockets and grads landing everywhere. They just decided, okay, this is the end of whatever's going on here. We'll just take everything. We started speaking to people looting Russians their own stuff, their own malls, and asking them what they thought about Ukraine and what they thought about Russia. And a lot of them told us that they were kind of happy under Ukrainian control, that they had, a few of them had their toilets fixed. These are some interviews I'd had. They'd been given more humanitarian aid than they'd been given by the Russian government. One of the Russians we spoke to had complained and said, oh, it's really annoying. There's so much rockets landing all the time. I can't stand it. And the soldier with me said, well, how do you think Ukrainians have felt for the last 3 years from what your country's doing? So that kind of made sense.
I remember seeing an interview in the first month of this 17-year-old Russian girl, a Russian teenager, who was ecstatic that Ukraine had taken her village because she wanted to immediately claim refugee status in Ukraine so that she could then immediately claim refugee status somewhere else in Europe. She just wanted out.
Yeah.
She didn't care about the war. She didn't care about her country. She didn't care about Ukraine. She only cared about herself, and I might have said something harsh about her in the video, but she's just a kid. She's just a 17-year-old. But she was like, thank God this happened, because now I can get to Europe. I can get to a real free and prosperous country. I mean, her life was basically just beginning, but if she made it to Ukraine, she was then probably able to make it to Germany or Poland or somewhere to escape Russia and start something new with her life. I don't know. It'd be fascinating if somebody found her in 2 or 3 years and checked up on what was she doing.
Yeah, I mean, that would be that, but that doesn't surprise me. I mean, Russians have been pretty indifferent to this war. A lot of people call this Putin's war, but it's not really. It's Russians' war. Russians don't really care about Ukraine. They don't really care about a lot, and stereotypes exist for a reason about Russia. And the indifference is basically, well, at least we have flushing toilets now. Don't really care who's running the place. I think a lot of them will follow the Ukrainians back across the border if Russians advance and take back Suja, but not because they love Ukraine, because they know it's a slightly better living condition. But this is the Russian mindset. This is the Soviet mindset. It's living in squalor with almost nothing, very harsh environment, and just getting whatever you can out of society for yourself. But it was pretty bleak seeing it. But it gave me an indication into how people were treated there on the ground as well. When you listen to interviews with soldiers or you look at state media and they're interviewing people who are either prisoners of war or people who are, under Ukrainian control, you might not always get the truth because this is coming from the government. But actually seeing it firsthand pretty much confirmed what I thought, which is people were pretty much happier to be around the Ukrainians. They were actually making an effort to speak Ukraine. 2 Russians living there spoke Ukraine to me, which was pretty unusual. But that trip made Russians furious in a way that I'd never seen them at me before. I mean, you can talk about Bucha, you can talk about the war crimes they've committed, you can talk about how heinous the invasion has been. But as soon as you cross their border into their sovereign land, they absolutely can't stand it. And that's why they've put every journalist that crossed that border onto a kill list. Basically, will throw you in prison or will assassinate you. And Reporters Without Borders have condemned this. On Russian Telegram channels, they said they will kill every single journalist who is ever caught that's crossed. They'll see them as combatants, because Russians have absolutely no regard for international borders when it comes to invading other countries. But the second you set foot, even a 5-minute drive across theirs, that's what upsets them more than anything else I've ever seen before. And the backlash from that was absolutely insane. I mean, it was like the worst I've ever had it from Russian accounts and Telegram channels and death threats, which just shows how insecure Russia is as a society as well. That's what really gets them is, humiliation, is laughing at their country and crossing their borders when they've been doing this to other countries for the last 100 years. So it was interesting as a bit of an experiment to show the reaction from Russians and going there so blatantly and saying, your country is a wasteland. I saw it for myself. I spoke to Russians there. But it was also good to actually see what was going on in terms of the counteroffensive. Probably the wildest thing I've ever done, actually. And that's it now. I can't take a flight over Belarus. The plane will get downed and I'll go to jail.
How do you feel about your personal safety being in Kyiv?
Well, I think Ukraine is the safest country in the world from the Russians right now. The Russians have infiltrated society in every single country in the West. There have been journalists killed and murdered by Russians, poisoned on British soil, across America as well. We've seen again, the Russian threat isn't taken seriously in America, whether it's cyber threat or physical threats, and they can do whatever they want. They can wreak havoc in Europe. Whereas in this country, they are actively hunting Russian officials and Russian saboteurs. Right, there is an entire government and military here with a front line to keep the Russians out. So I feel much safer in Ukraine than anywhere else in Europe from Russians. Serena Zabriskie, a really good friend of mine, says the same thing. She had her house ransacked in California years ago by suspected Russians for her reporting. She said that wouldn't happen in Odessa, that wouldn't happen in Kyiv, because they actually know what the Russian threat is here, and they hunt them down all the time. Russian spies don't stay Russian spies for very long in Kyiv. So I'm much happier here than anywhere else. So, it's okay. It's pretty scary because, there's a lot of sabotage that still happens in Ukraine, just as everywhere, but it's usually against military vehicles and things like that. Russians paying teenagers to blow things up. But forever, they will never forget that, and that'll be something on my head. I could never visit Russia, not that I would want to, but there are countries like Iran, Belarus, where they would take me across and throw me in jail in Siberia.
You mentioned journalist Zarina Zabriskie. She's focused a lot about the city of Kherson in the last year. The situation has gotten pretty bad. I always check her feed. I see all of her posts. It's heartbreaking what's happening there, and it's getting almost no attention. So can you explain for the people the situation in Kherson, what specifically has been happening?
Well, it's extremely unique in terms of a war zone. I was first in Kherson a few months after it was liberated. This is a city, if you imagine what London looks like, it's got a river that flows through it. When the Russians occupied that city, they were pushed back just south of that river. They blew the bridges so the Ukrainians wouldn't chase them any further. They set up bank on the South River, and they started bombing that city the second they crossed the river. And that was an artillery threat. And I remember when I was there with John, hundreds of times a day, they were pounding that city with bombs and munitions. And I only felt safe on the north side of the buildings rather than the south, because that's, you knew where the direction was from the south of the river. Super scary. About June 2024, the Russians pulled out a map and they declared the entire city of Kherson a red zone, a kill zone. That basically means all civilians are legitimate military targets in a major city of 60,000 people. A tall, built-up cosmopolitan city, right, with cafes and restaurants. And they started using drones for the first time to hunt those civilians. And I didn't realize just how serious it was until I got there. Zarina called me 4 months ago, and she said, Caolan, I'm in Kherson right now, and they're doing something called the human safari. They're literally hunting taxis, public buses, random people in the street, and they're being paid incentives to do it, or the Russians are doing it for target practice before they go to the east. And I almost couldn't believe it. And again, just like wanting to come to Ukraine for the first time, I wanted to see it for myself. And I'm only funded by Patreon and 100 people on Patreon. So I don't have all these big security and resources. So I just jumped on a bus for $5 and went there with my phone and my camera. And I didn't realize that there was just one bus in and out, and ended up staying there. Within 2 hours of arriving, there was a drone already hovering above our car. And I put all this in my documentary, Hunted in Kherson. And locals I started speaking to told me that the only protection they have from these drones are the leaves on the trees or when it's windy outside, like Mother Nature protecting them, which was bizarre. But that feeling I had in 2023, being protected from artillery from the side of the buildings, was gone. Suddenly, you could send a drone right into a window and another one straight through. They can kill you in your bed and they can take you anywhere. The entire city was open season, and I've never felt like that in my life. It was like being completely naked. And I ended up calling a friend walking down the street one morning, and about a minute later, a drone started hovering above my head. And this is all in the film. And I'm looking up and like running between these different tree covers to get away from it. And a friend later told me this was very likely because I had a UK SIM card. The Russians bombed the cell towers in Kherson, built 2,000 new cell towers on their side. They used that to steal the phone signal communication to know who comes in and out of that city, who are foreign volunteers, who's helping civilians, who's doing what, and they used that to kill people coming in. So it was like Mad Max. It was like something out of a science fiction film in a major built-up city. Like, I'd seen frontline places in trenches in the east, right? Military style, in the mud, but never in a place with cafes and restaurants and supermarkets and buildings 30 stories high with drones going and just basically blowing everything up. While we were there, I witnessed grenades being dropped on cars, hundreds of attacks a night. I'd never seen anything like it. So I put this together in 5 days. I edited it as fast as humanly possible, filmed it kind of gonzo style. As a person who isn't just a hardened war correspondent, but like a newbie to covering a war, just experiencing this. And it got 2 million views. And the 3 weeks that came after that, the civilians in Kherson, whose number I got, told me that they had been inundated with requests from journalists, from Wall Street Journal, from the Financial Times, who had arrived in Kherson because they had seen that documentary to do a follow-up. And so it pushed Kherson in that period into the mainstream media kind of coverage, which literally was all I wanted. And it just shows that sometimes it just takes literally going to these places on your own and raw filming everything organically as it unfolds to get stories into the mainstream. But geez, it's gotten worse. I'm actually going back to Kherson in a few weeks. I just got my accreditation, and I'm going to make a follow-up called When the Leaves Fell, because now the leaves are gone. And the people in that film have been telling me that it's so much worse. There's no protection whatsoever now, and people just hide inside 24/7. And this is new for Kherson again. The drones only started being used in June last year. It was warm in June. There hasn't been a situation here in Kherson where there's been drone warfare and no leaves on the trees. So this is unprecedented, and there's no journalists. There's honestly no journalists there right now. And no one really knows what's going on. So that's the next project, is to go back. But my God, I've never seen anything like it before. It's unbelievable.
Could you get around at night? Like, do these drones that the Russians are using, are they using thermals or infrared, or is it? You're right. The only way you can get around safely is if it's windy or raining or nighttime potentially. But I imagine I know the people who are remaining there. You said 60,000, but the pre-war population of Kherson was 300,000.
Mm-hmm.
How many people remain? Yeah, 50,000, 1/6 of the original city's population. I know there are some dedicated people who are never going to leave their hometown. They're going to keep living there and fighting there and accepting the risks. But yeah, the question: what do you do? How do you make the Russians stop this?
Well, the people that stay there because that's where their roots are. That's what I mean, at the end of my film, I interviewed a 83-year-old woman who said, my husband's buried here, my son is buried here. If the Russians came and said, we'll either shoot you or you leave. I'll tell them to shoot me. Why should we have to leave? And every time they bomb us and every time they use a drone, it makes us stronger. It makes us hate Putin more. And she learned Ukrainian for the first time in her life recently, just as an act of strength against it. And that's what the people of Kherson are. Unbelievable. But there isn't really a way to stop this right now because the West is too preoccupied arguing amongst themselves about who is actually even responsible for the invasion. Look what the United States is doing. I mean, Kherson it feels completely isolated at the edge of the earth, and I mean, it's the strangest place I've ever been, and I don't know how people can still survive there every single day. And there is no defense to it. You know, you say going out at night, A, there's a curfew at 8 p.m., so no one goes out at night. But B, the thermal cameras are used on drones because I left a microphone outside when I was in Kherson and it caught lots of different grenade drops and explosions. So they're obviously using those against anyone that's out past curfew or just cars or anything like that or going into people's houses. And there isn't a defense because, again, Ukraine hasn't had the funding it needs and the technology hasn't developed enough to be able to jam these drones. You know, there's AI going into these drones from the Russian side that can actually detect where the signals are coming from that are counter signals from jammers and go straight into them. So that doesn't work. The only defense that I saw in Kherson were guys going around in cars with shotguns shooting at the drones. So you know a drone's coming because you hear the shotguns beforehand. Like, you know, like the Wild West meets cyber attacks, you know, from the sky. It's completely unusual and unprecedented, and there is no defense. And the locals called it the third nightmare. They said the first nightmare was the occupation, the second nightmare was the artillery, and the third nightmare are these drones. And that's it. There's nothing you can do.
I just want to say this out loud, but if the Russians are willing to do this to the civilian city of Kherson, they're willing to do it to any city. If they have a close enough signal to send cheap drones just to kill random elderly people walking down the street, they'll do it to any city and any people, any country. So yeah, it's shameful the recent position that the new administration has taken, denying that any of this is real or denying that any of this matters to the United States. When Russia is perfecting a new technology to mass kill civilians in urban areas that they will deploy on any city in the world that resists or tries to repel whatever they want.
And when J.D. Vance says that censorship laws against free speech are more of a threat to Europe than Russia, that's what the most galling part of it was in that entire delegation nightmare.
He's talking about censorship against Russian and Chinese propaganda infiltrating our democracies.
Yeah, you know, it wasn't censorship laws that crashed a drone into Chernobyl yesterday. It was Russia attacking a nuclear power station, former nuclear power station, potentially unleashing hell on Europe again. That is what the threat is. And while literally radioactive gas was still coming out of Chernobyl, Vance was giving that speech. Like this, it's absolutely insane. But again, we don't understand the Russian threat, or we do and we choose to ignore it, or our politicians are in the pocket of Russians. I don't know which one it is, probably a mix of all three, but it is absolutely completely pushed to one side. And here it's been left to the Ukrainians to fight this war for everyone in the West, for the whole of Europe, because Russia has been at war with all of us in different ways for decades. They've shot down planes over our skies. They've poisoned people on our soils. They've interfered with our democracies. They've pumped sewage of misinformation into our news feeds. They're already an enemy of ours, and Ukrainians are the only ones that understand that and are fighting it for us, and we're not even allowing them to do it. And if Ukraine falls and Putin looks west and sits in Kyiv, he's going to do exactly what he's doing in Kherson to every other city attached to Ukraine. He's going to do this in Poland, and he's going to do this until the original borders are back to where he remembers them. And Ukraine are willing to fight this for us for what? 0.1% of our GDP. That's how much we're spending arming Ukraine. And even doubling that of each European country would allow this country to win. And we don't, because we've been convinced that that money is being taken from homeless people in the streets because of misinformation. And that's what's so depressing about all of this. And the Russian army are going to be much harder to defeat in the towns and cities in the rest of Europe than they are in the fields of Ukraine right now, when this army is willing to do it for us. And that's something I hope never happens. But when I saw those drones in Kherson, and when I sat in my apartment in Odessa and I saw tracers blowing up drones in the night sky, an air defense which looked like Star Wars, I imagined sitting in cities in Europe one day and thinking, will I see the same view out my window? Will I see the same red tracers shooting the same Russian artillery and munitions out of the sky? Maybe. And it feels like it will move west. And that's the same view that I'll see again in Europe. Europe's seen this before. The view outside my window in Odessa looked like the Blitz. It looked like photos of the Blitz with searchlights and red bullets flying through the sky. Europe has seen this before, and it'll see it again unless it wakes up to this stuff. And it's so hard to comprehend unless you see it firsthand and realize this is already happening in Europe, you know?
So let's now make the connection and talk about your recent trip to Syria over New Year's and Russia's impact on that country. So can you explain when did you go to Syria? Why did you go to Syria? And what did you learn there?
Well, I remember the reports that Assad might fall happening back in November. And I turned to my friend Audrey McAlpine. She's a journalist at United 24 from Nashville. And I said, I think that these rebels are going to take the country. I think they're going to overthrow Assad. And a lot of people thought that was ludicrous. But I'd heard rumors that the rebels were using drones in the same way that the Ukrainians were using drones to make advances in cities in Aleppo, and they were it was working. And the more equipment that they got towards Damascus, the more armed they got. There were these rebels looking at videos of how to fly helicopters. They were taking more things, and it kind of became exponential. And then I woke up one morning on a Sunday. The church bells here in the square in St. Michael's Square were playing, and Assad had fled to Moscow. And I walked outside in the snow and I made a really quick video saying, this is a massive humiliation for Putin. This is his naval base gone. This is his stronghold in the Middle East gone. And his friend has fled to Moscow. This is also happening because he's stretching Ukraine. This is a day to celebrate. Church bells ringing out all over Ukraine. Felt very symbolic. And that video got 3 million views. And I was like, I don't think enough people are making the Russian angle clear enough and just how important it is. Like, Assad was backed by Russia and Moscow. He was allowed to carry this on because of Russia. And again, Assad didn't go to Dubai. He didn't go to Jordan. He went to Moscow. All the reporting I saw from Damascus in the days afterwards from media focused on the torture. They focused on the prisons, but there wasn't an emphasis on what this specifically meant for Russia. So that's immediately what I wanted to do. And I'd never been to the Middle East before. So I was like, this is like doing it on expert mode. I could have at least sort of like slowly worked my way in, maybe gone to Saudi Arabia on a little holiday first, but no, went straight in. And me and Audrey sat down on the computer behind me a week before we decided to go on New Year's Eve. And we said, right, how do we get to Damascus? Well, there's no flights going in and out. But it looks like you can get a taxi from Beirut. We called some journalists there and they said, well, what's your security detail? We were asking them for advice. And we said, well, we're just going to get a taxi from Beirut. And they were just laughing like, what are you talking about? You can't come to Syria. There's no laws. They didn't just release the political prisoners. They released millions of prisoners. They emptied the prisons and the police are gone because they work for the regime. And it's Syria. You can't just rock up. And I said, I think we can do it. I got to Kursk. I've seen abandoned Russian tanks there. And in Kherson, I want to see the abandoned Russian tanks in the Middle East. So we book a flight to Beirut. We get into a taxi. We get to the checkpoint, get a stamp to leave Lebanon, and they just say, good luck, goodbye. And then suddenly it's this no man's land. And you can't drive a taxi with a Lebanon license plate into Syria. And you can't drive a Syrian license plate into Lebanon. So suddenly the taxi just goes. So we're like, all right, okay, we're on foot now, going through this no man's land of shot up Assad posters and abandoned military equipment. We get to the Syrian side, and we've got 5 hours until midnight on New Year's Eve. And there's just mayhem, bedlam, because all of the customs staff we're working for the regime. So they're gone. So no one's knowing how to do this thing. There's just militias with guns trying to see who has what documents. There's thousands of cars with everyone's belongings on the roof who had fled during the regime, trying to return home before midnight on New Year's Eve. And it's like mayhem. Fights are breaking out. It's like absolute chaos. So we just throw a bunch of cash to one of the guys at the checkpoint and they just wave us through. No stamp on the passport. We don't exist. We're nowhere. Just saying we left Beirut. You know, this was wild. And then we arrive in the center of Damascus like 2 hours before New Year's Eve. And even though the city is massive chaos, there's no traffic wardens, there's no waste management because, again, all worked for the government, all fled. So there's like absolute mayhem. We go straight to where the center is, start hearing the sounds of AK-47s and gunshots, fireworks going off, fireworks which were illegal during the Assad regime, and praises and chants and songs that were all banned during the regime, songs of celebration. I find this busted up, crushed police car with smashed windows that had been bashed up from the Assad regime, climbed on top of it, and then quickly made a video saying, it's midnight, I'm here on New Year's Eve in Damascus, hoping for the same liberation from Russia in Ukraine next year. And I interviewed loads of young people and old people, Christians and Muslims, about what they thought about Ukraine. One of them gave me a Ukraine hat. And they were like, we didn't know what it was before. Now we love them because we know what the same evil is. F Russia. It was just ecstatic. It was incredible. And the point of that was to show that when dictators fall, good things happen. And dictators can and do fall. And the West needs to stop being so terrified of this. Terrified, what happens if Putin falls? It's greater Russia. Well, people celebrate in the streets. It's now been 2 months and society's returned back to normal. It's okay for tyrants to fall. And they're weaker than we think. So that was great. But then I woke up the next morning. It's a bit like, you know, when you go on holiday and the first morning you wake up, you forget where you are. You like don't realize that you just traveled, you're on holiday, you think you're in your bed. And I was like, and I opened the window, I could just see Assad's palace over the whole of Damascus. And I thought, what the hell am I doing here? So I think that was the realization after the adrenaline of just what we'd gotten into. And our guide, Ali, said, you know, I want to take you to a place called Duma. In 2018, there was a chemical attack that was carried out here. It was covered up by Russia. The hard left and the hard right all said it was lies. Russia today put all these people on television who apparently witnessed this and put them in front of the Hague and said that there was nothing, that it didn't happen. But 56 people died and it was true. And maybe you can tell their stories for the first time. So I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. We get on this road to Duma, and our driver says, you know, this is still really dangerous. There are still Russians everywhere. There's no laws. And there are people from the regime that don't want this exposed, that were working with the Russians and complicit. So you've got to be really careful. Don't wear the same clothes each day twice. Change hotels every day. There are a list of hotels in that city, like the Four Seasons, where if you check in, that name is sent to... It's on a database where people know where you are. So we avoided all the fancy hotels and had to stay in like weird places. And we got to Duma and we got to the street where this chemical attack had happened, right? 2 barrel bombs dropped from Russian helicopters, killed all these people and children. And this guy comes running out of his house screaming, saying, no journalists, get out, go away, telling us to leave. And I was like, what's wrong with him? Oh my God, this is so scary. We need to go. And Ali spoke to him for ages and he said, it's okay, he'll talk to you now. Let's come into his house. He brings me into his house and shows me pictures of his 3 daughters and his wife that were killed in that gas attack in his arms, in his kitchen. Watch them take their last breaths. And I said, why did you hate journalists so much? And he said, because every journalist that has ever come here has been a Russian journalist from Russia Today. They interrogated me, they used Russian officials, they tortured me, and they forced me to lie and say that my children didn't even exist, that there was no gas and that none of this happened. And we thought you were a Russian journalist because why the hell is there an American and an Irish person here in Duma? Like, you know, what are you doing? So that was unbelievable. And then he brought together everyone that testified at The Hague and said that there was no gas. They all basically lined up and told us that they were flown to Moscow. They showed us flight logs of this, forced to lie, give false testimonies, interrogated by Russian authorities, not rogue militias, and taken to The Hague and say that none of this happened. And I told them, I said, you know, is this a risk to tell us this? And they said, yeah, we could all be killed. You could be killed telling this story. So you need to get this stuff out. And I said, would you guys be willing to retestify if this footage gets out? And they all said yes. So I submitted this footage. I called up my friend, Hamish de Bretton Gordon. He was in charge of NATO's chemical weapons response during the 2018 chemical attack. He was overseeing a lot of the stuff with the UN delegation that went to Duma, that got fired on, that tried to investigate this. And he said, Caolan, what you found is stuff that we have tried to get out of Syria for years and haven't been able to. This has been debated for so long. This is invaluable. We need all of their phone numbers, all of these testimonies. You need to get this information out and get it out of Syria. We're going to use it to reopen the case. And I didn't even know what Duma was before I got to Syria. So suddenly I'm just like, this country has been a prison for decades. No one is allowed to tell their stories. There's no freedom. And suddenly everyone is just screaming to tell the world just what happened here. And the stories of torture that they experienced were the same stories of torture that I heard from victims in Kherson, in Zaporizhia, in occupied areas. Because it's the same evil, and it's not just in Ukraine, it's all over the planet. It's in the dusty villages of the Middle East. It's in the towns in the Donbass. This is what Russia is. And it just like kind of set in the scale of it all. So me and Audrey sat down, we looked for the last victim, we interviewed a doctor who then called us up 15 minutes afterwards on our last day there, and he said, we've just received 2 threats from people speaking in Russian accents saying that they know that I've spoken to you and they're threatening to kill me and they're looking for you. So we make this very last minute decision that we probably can't get this footage out of Syria. We might get stopped at the border. Anything could happen to us. We don't have enough internet to upload all the raw footage. So we put together some of the testimonies and just uploaded it as a 15-minute report while we were there on the last day, which was terrifying. The next day we did manage to get out, but all of the people who testified are now going to be retestifying, and this is part of a bigger documentary that we're doing. But I remember when we left Syria, after everything we'd experienced and all the amazing people that we met, I was just thinking back to the people that we spoke to, and every single one of them, I asked them why they told me their stories despite the danger, and they said, because people need to know what Russia has done here. We understand if it's our own people, Assad, Alawites versus different sects of Islam, there's civil wars going on, but this hostile state coming in and murdering us from outside, it was even worse than what was already going on there. And they said truth matters. Truth is everything. And it was just incredible. And I remember we got to the checkpoint that had now been fixed and set up after these 10 days that we were there for. And suddenly they had new employees and they had systems in place. And it was like order was returning. And we walked in and they were looking for the stamp on our passport. And they were like, excuse me, how have you been in Syria for a week without a stamp? I said, you don't know what it was like last week. It was a whole different situation, I swear. I don't want to ask about it. And there were buckets of paint everywhere. And the checkpoint that was covered in Assad in this mustard green was suddenly painted white. And I remember just the smell of fresh paint with the stamp in my passport, leaving Syria, new regime, hope to survive now without the tyranny of Russia. But it was unbelievable. And so I've been editing this film now, for the last week, but there's still Russians there. And I hope they all finish up and get out. There was a Russian massive propagandist woman I recognized who was sitting in the HTS administrative building, who was a TV host in Russia, and she was trying to get an interview with them. And I remember thinking, oh my God, Russia's still here. This is like the state TV representative. So me and Audrey just sat next to her and really loudly talked about how great it was going to Kursk and how much of a shithole it was. And she was just getting so angry, sitting there listening to this, knowing that they couldn't do anything. But there's still a presence there. But they're pretty persona non grata, as they should be, all over the world.
Thank you, Caolan, for getting this evidence, this video, this proof out. And yeah, I can't help but think about the other current events happening this week. What if J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, took the podium in Munich or whatever and said, we now know the truth of Russian war crimes in Syria. Let me share this evidence. This is what matters. Human lives, human value. And he's not doing that. Leadership from the United States does not care about people in Ukraine or Syria or any other locations in the future where the Russians are going to want to torture and kill and imprison innocent people. So yeah, these are dark times. Yeah, this is going to be a struggle, and I really appreciate what you're doing because you took considerable risks. Being a non-Muslim, going to Syria. There's a whole host of reasons why various groups would want to grab you and either kill you or ransom you and try and turn a quick profit. So I like would now that you went through it and you experienced all that, would you do that? Would you do something like that again?
I think it depends on how important the story is and if it's not being covered. I don't go to these places because I want some sort of adrenaline hit. I hate going to these places. I don't sleep going to these places. And it takes me about a week to recover mentally before I can even return to knowing what's normal anymore. It causes mental disassociation, it's damaging for you to go to these places. It's you almost question your own sanity at so many points. But if there's another opportunity somewhere in the world, maybe Georgia, I don't know where there's a story that isn't being covered enough that I can tell, that I can afford to go to, then I'll still do it because, I don't have political power, money, any resources, but I feel like I'm really good at telling stories and capturing evidence. And if I can do that in a place that isn't being told enough or where stories aren't being told enough, then that's what I'm gonna do. And it's how I ended the Under Deadly Skies film with John Sweeney. I had a quote that Eisenhower said in 1945, and it said, "Get it all on tape, get it all the records, because one day down the line, some bastard's going to come along and say that none of this happened." And that was talking about the liberation of the camps and making sure it was all filmed. And I just feel like that's the most meaningful stuff I've ever done, is just to get it all on tape. So I probably will keep doing stuff like this. It's only been 6 months and it's already been Kherson, the front line, Kursk, and Syria. I'm sure 2025 there's going to be a lot more, but I don't know what the future holds. It depends. Things change every day.
Maybe Belarus, Transnistria, and Crimea somehow?
That would be a great holiday to have this summer, if possible.
Let's hope
Yeah.
that conditions change where you can go to those three areas. For anyone
Yeah.
still listening to this, you made it this far, I'm going to put Caolan's Patreon link down below. If you want to support him directly, you can give him $5 a month so he can continue putting his life at risk to get stories about war crimes committed by the Russians out to the world. So, Caolan, we've been talking, I think, for almost an hour here. Is there anything else you would like to say or potentially ask me or discuss in these uncertain times?
I don't know. I mean, there's been so much that's happened and that's going on. I mean, how does it feel being in the US, watching the way that it's being represented in Europe? Like, I haven't asked any Americans this yet because this has only just happened in the last 2 days. Watching Posobiec here in the city, watching what they're saying at Munich, watching what they're talking about to do with Canada and annexing Canada. Like, how does it feel as an American watching this unfold?
I just put out my monthly question and answer video, and what you're asking me is a lot of what my Canadian and European viewers are asking me, and I don't hold back. I'm not going to hold back how I think and what I feel as a veteran, as an American, um, because the United States is seriously at risk. And, Donald Trump got 50% of the popular vote, 70 some million people. Kamala Harris got 47, 48% of the vote. And I am curious, like, for people who didn't bother to vote or voted for Kamala Harris. Well, I mean, I read the comments. I know people are shocked and horrified, but they're almost, there is this degree of being demoralized. For people paying attention to Donald Trump in Europe, if you've not been paying attention to him for the last 10 years, you have a luxury. For the people of America who have been opposing this constant stream of lying, this constant displays of buffoonery and nonsensical indifference towards human suffering and misery, like here in America, the people on the left or even the center or even traditional Reagan conservatives have been enduring this nonstop barrage of lies and information from Donald Trump for over 10 years now, because he started running for president in 2015. And people are just so hopeless and defeated at the moment because of the election. But people are going to turn around. the last 15 minutes of my Q&A. It was an hour-long Q&A that I filmed. But the last 15 minutes, I explain why Donald Trump and Elon Musk are going to lose, why they are going to be defeated. So I give a whole host of reasons. I lay out my thesis, why this experiment in fascism is going to fail. But there's going to be some struggles. There's going to be some rioting. There's going to be some confusion about who's actually in charge at certain points over the next 4 years. And these are not going to be easy times. But this is what the Russians wanted. At the end of the day, the reason why the Russians were funneling tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into making sure that Donald Trump won is so that America destroys itself. America turns in on itself and can't be there to help Ukraine or help Europe or help partners in the Middle East or wherever. So I see what's coming. It's a slow motion car crash. Americans will wake up. Americans will resist. It is not going to be fun the next 4 years. But these first 3 weeks, I have Canadian subscribers who are outraged saying, why aren't people protesting what Donald Trump is saying about Canada and to that degree? And it's coming. The culture is going to shift. It's going to catch up. I don't know. Do you have a follow-up question? Everyone here in America is still outraged and shocked. We just are kind of paralyzed because we've been enduring this for a decade now. It shouldn't happen this way, Caolan. Nobody should have to put up with or listen to any political figure for more than 10 years. We have term limits for presidents of 8 years for a very good reason. And if Donald Trump lives and stays in office for the next four years, that's 14 years. I have talked to Gen Z people in their early, mid-20s, and they don't remember Mitt Romney being the nominee in 2012. They don't remember John McCain in 2008. They've only known Donald Trump's brand of politics of lie, 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 attack, 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 never take responsibility or accountability for anything. And when something bad happens that you caused, you just blame the other side. You just make stuff up and say everything that's bad that's happening is their fault. Everything that is good is happening. I did myself. Only I can make America great. It's fascism.
Yeah.
It's just fascism.
Yeah, because I think my outlook on that was it's, Trump, there are a million different Trumps. J.D. Vance could be the next Trump. Trump's children could be the next Trump. But it feels like the rot that sets in that allowed him to come to power, that made millions of Americans vote for him, the disinformation, Russian interference, like that will always be there. And whoever Trump is at the top will be changed. Or do you think that it's pretty much like personality around him?
Well, every dictator does the exact same thing. They don't want an heir apparent. Because if there's an heir, then you might be able to kill the guy in charge and then go to his successor. So who is the heir apparent or successor to Vladimir Putin? There is not one deliberately. The number one rule in a dictatorship is you're not allowed to outshine the boss. In dictatorships, autocracies, it's the same concentration of power where you just say, my son eventually is going to take over. Kim Jong-il's health was failing. I think he was only in his 60s, but he died, and they had to come up with the next iteration of the Kim regime. This is a hereditary dictatorship, dynastic control. Kim Jong-un took control of the country, and he was only like 31 or something. They lied about his age to make him look older. But the guy's younger than me, and he potentially might be in charge of the country for the next 30 or 40 years if he doesn't eat himself to death. So Putin never had adult sons, I think he has sons now that are illegitimate, that are being hidden, but from his first marriage, he only had 2 daughters. Neither one of them are deeply involved in politics. And Donald Trump this week was asked by, I think this was CBS, or maybe it was Brett Baier or something, and Donald Trump was asked, is J.D. Vance your successor in 2028? And he didn't even hesitate. He said no. He's like, no, J.D. Vance is not my successor in 2028. And then he rambled off some other things, but that leaves the question, well, who does Trump think is going to be in charge of the country in 2028? It's either him because he doesn't plan on leaving office, or it could be Ivanka or Tiffany or Eric or Don. We are not going to have a free and fair presidential election in 2028 in which Donald Trump does not abuse the office and leverage all aspects of the federal government to make sure that he or whoever he picks stays in power forever. So it's a fight. It's going to be a ground war here in the United States. We have federalism. We have, thankfully, there's no way for the federal government to rig federal elections because every state manages their own elections. You can rig the vote in North Carolina if you can control the voting apparatus, but you can't do it in every state at the same time. The states individually run their own elections and then report the results. And in the 2020 election, Donald Trump just did not accept the results when he lost. He lost, and he did not accept the outcome of the 2020 election. We had the January 6th insurrection that destroyed the Capitol, and he should have gone to jail for that, but he kept lying, and he got the nomination, and then he won again. So I'm hoping, I'm seriously hoping, Caolan, that we can come through this on the other side. And there will be some segments. I know 36% of the country is gone. They know the truth and they're lying on purpose because they think it's to their benefit. But there is this genuine 15% of the American voting population that is confused. They believe the lies. And those are the people that need to wake up and say, I made a terrible mistake. Let's try and undo this.
Yeah, Michael Moore said the same thing actually years ago in Fahrenheit 11/9 or 9. I think it was 9/11. He was like, "America is actually it is a nation of good people," and actually polling shows it's majority like liberal values. It's for gay marriage overwhelmingly. It's for the right to have freedom of religion, freedom of there's this. It's actually like super liberal in its polling, but there is that percentage of people that can be persuaded. That's what he talks about. It reminds me of that. It's nice.
I think Donald Trump won this election because of economics, and he lied about why things are getting worse. We have increasing wealth inequality in the United States. We have increasing income inequality in the United States caused structurally by our tax policies, by continuously providing tax cuts to the ultra wealthy, by reducing long-term capital gains rates. The middle class is just shrinking. It's evaporating. People are struggling with the costs of healthcare and paying rent and the price of eggs or whatever. And Donald Trump exploited that without saying the structural reasons why it's happening. The price of eggs are going up. This is Kamala Harris's fault. Wokeism caused things to become more expensive. The arguments don't make sense, and he's offering no solutions to fix them. His first 3 weeks in office, he's renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America and threatening to invade Greenland, Panama, Gaza, and Canada. Nothing economically is going to get better. Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency is not there to reduce government spending. Donald Trump's first term in office, government spending never went down. The national deficit went up every single year, and that's going to happen again in his next term. The federal government, he's talking about taking defense spending to 5% of GDP. That would take the defense budget from $900 billion a year to like $1.4 trillion. Government spending under Donald Trump is never going to come down. Yeah. The national debt is never going to come down. We're going to have a budget fight in March. They're going to have to raise the debt ceiling. And Republicans in Congress are demanding that the debt ceiling be raised by $4 trillion.
Yeah.
What's Elon Musk doing if we're not actually bringing down government spending? It's just nonsense and lies and political hackery.
Did you see all the videos of MAGA voters saying they were super annoyed that inflation's still going up, that the prices of things haven't dropped or they're still going up? And then there was a lot of people saying the stuff that J.D. Vance is saying is to kind of distract, blame Europe for everything, talk about Europe's problems. But you can, have you seen those videos?
I'm not on TikTok. I know a lot of people are confused and they're reacting, but I don't think anything economically is the price of nothing is going to come down this year. Nothing.
Yeah.
And with these tariffs going up everywhere, everything is going to get more expensive. And people like you and I, or whoever, we need to be there to provide good information so that that 15% that voted for Trump who doesn't understand it, I'm sorry, but these people just don't understand the basics of anything. But we need them. We need their votes to take our democracy back.
It's true. It's really good to hear your perspective on that. It's actually made me feel so much better about the US. So, yeah, makes sense.
All right, Caolan, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your service to the truth and journalism. Once again, your links for your social media, I'm going to put down below. Is there any closing thoughts you have for the audience?
Just get your news from on the ground sources as much as you can, which you amplify all the time, Jake. So I guess just keep following your feed. But thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Caolan. Great talking to you.